So, as Robert mentioned, I have been wanting to do a message on Martin Luther King and A Course in Miracles for a while now. But the need to do it has become stronger in recent months. And since tomorrow is his birthday, it's fitting to reflect on King's legacy and its relevance to the Course and to our time. Like so many others, I've always been captivated by Martin Luther King. It comes in part from living in the American South, which is ground zero for what King called the long night of racial injustice. You can't live here and not feel it still, whether it's the huge Confederate flag that waves on I-85 near where I live, to being near Mother Emanuel Church recently, where 9 members of a Bible study group were gunned down in 2015. And so I'm captivated by Martin Luther King for what he was able to achieve in getting us closer to what he called the promise of democracy and to America's founding creed that all men are created equal. We've still got a long way to go, but King's ability to hold a vision that stretched an entire nation in the direction of goodness and equality, I believe, is unlike anything we've seen in modern history. But I'm also captivated by Martin Luther King because I'm a student of A Course in Miracles. And as I keep saying, so often people will come to Robert or I and say some form of the course is just like this teaching or just like that book. The course is just like quantum physics. It's just like The Way of Mastery or The Power of One or Urantia or the Seth books or what this teacher is saying, and on and on and on the list goes. And while I'll be the first to admit that I don't venture very far from the course and what I study, from what I have read, aside from the small amount of what we can credibly call Jesus's own authentic teachings that are found in the New Testament, there is something astonishingly close to the heart of the message of A Course in Miracles, and that's the message of Martin Luther King. I've been saying that the message of Martin Luther King and the message of A Course in Miracles overlap for a long time. But I'm embarrassed to say that it was only when Robert and I went to Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, the church where Martin Luther King preached, that I noticed a connection that I hadn't made before. At the very top of the pledge cards that all members of the civil rights movement were required to sign is the instruction to meditate daily on the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, King was a Baptist preacher, so on the surface, that might not seem so unorthodox, but the language he used is centered on Jesus's teachings and his life, not his death or the payment for our sins. And that is unorthodox for a Baptist preacher. And so it brings up a question that we've never fully explored. What if the civil rights movement understood Jesus far better than some of our most prominent scholars, pastors, channelers, and public theologians? I believe they did. Because the protesters of the civil rights movement were mocked, they were beaten, they were killed, and still they lived by the principles of that pledge card that also included walk and talk in the manner of love, be used by God in order that all men might be free, be kind to friend and foe, refrain from violence of fist, tongue, or heart. Now, who does that sound like to you? Jesus. And who gave them that message? King. And so last spring, after Robert and I returned from Atlanta, I got really curious about what it was specifically that inspired Martin Luther King most about Jesus. What was it about his life and his teachings that he most wanted others to know? And it turns out that King gave the answer to that question himself in a sermon called Loving Your Enemies, a sermon that was so meaningful to him that he delivered it and he kept polishing it by his own words at least once a year. I love this sermon, and I'm going to use it as the heart of the message today, not only because it's centered around 3 ideas that could be straight from the Course, but because it demonstrates that the principles found in the Course work. As a bit of a timeline, though, it's worth noting that King first delivered the Loving Your Enemies sermon in 1957. And as I mentioned, he kept delivering it every year, different versions of it, right until his death in 1968. And that's the very window in which the Course began to come through. Helen Schuckman scribed A Course in Miracles from 1965 to 1972. And given how concerned the Course is with equality, I've done a few sermons about what the Course has to say about equality in the past. The fact that the civil rights movement was going on at the same time and doesn't appear in Helen's notes has always felt like a pity and a bit of a tragedy to me. King died 8 years before the Course was published. He had no way of knowing about A Course in Miracles, and yet his message was and remains an embodiment of its teachings. So, for example, I mentioned before that the Loving Your Enemies sermon centered on 3 ideas that could be straight out of the Course. And those are: hate only causes more hate, hate distorts the hater, and love is redemptive. And I want to go through the parallels between King and the Course in each of these one by one, starting with hate only causes more hate. Now, in his sermon, King tells this story. It's the story of where he and his brother were driving from Atlanta to Tennessee, and his brother was getting increasingly angry because the other drivers weren't dimming their lights as they passed by, and so it was blinding to him. And so essentially, King's brother says, the next car that passes and it doesn't dim their lights, I am not going to dim mine and see how they like it. And King's response was, and then there'd be too much light on the highway and then we'd all be in trouble. And that's a paraphrase, but his exact words were, somebody must have sense enough to dim the lights. And that's the trouble, isn't it? To highlight the point, King's sermon goes on to say, if I hit you and you hit me and I hit you back and you hit me back and go on, that goes on ad infinitum. It just never ends. Somewhere, somebody must have a little sense, and that's the strong person. The strong person is the person who can cut off the chain of hate, the chain of evil. And that is the tragedy of hate, that it doesn't cut it off. It only intensifies the existence of hate and evil in the universe. End quote. It's interesting that King uses the phrase chain of hate, because in the back of the Complete and Annotated Edition of the Course, there's a cameo called the Chain of Miscreation. The cameo tells how Jesus walked Helen and Bill through one of their days, pointing out how one unloving error led to another and to another and to another, until eventually the whole day ends up off track, and Helen and Bill end up angry and upset with each other. And in the cameo, Robert describes it as unloving thoughts and unguided decisions leading to hurtful actions. This hurtfulness towards others then returns to us, then goes back out from us to still more people. So now we're stuck. We can't be loving because our mind has been hijacked by anger, causing us to lose ourselves in what Jesus labeled creating ugliness. This is the chain of hate, or the chain of miscreation. And one of the more sobering parts of Helen's guidance is Jesus says that we have to learn not to let this chain reaction start. He says you will not be able to control it once it has started, because everything and everyone will be pulled into this misprojection and misinterpreted accordingly. And doesn't that feel unsettling and true? Once the anger gets going, both personally in our lives and more broadly in the world, it does not take long before we lose control and everything and everyone gets pulled into creating ugliness. The solution that both Jesus and King recommended is guarding our mind so that our thoughts are free of hate and able to love. On the day that they went off track, Jesus told Helen that mind watching would have prevented any of this from occurring and will do so anytime you permit it. So that's what allows us to have the sense to dim the lights and be the strong person who stops the chain of miscreation and the chain of hate by, as King said, injecting within the very structure of the universe that strong and powerful element of love. Maya Angelou said, hate has caused a lot of problems in this world, but it hasn't solved one problem yet. If only we could remember that. The second idea from the Loving Your Enemies sermon that I want to highlight is that hate distorts the haters. King phrased it that hate distorts the personality of the hater, but the Course would say hate distorts the mind of the hater. Either way, in the sermon, King says that hate is ruinous to the person who hates. And that is such a strong word, ruinous. And yet, that is what we see happening all around us. Hate in the form of anger and attack is just a wrecking ball that destroys anything and everything in its path. Marriages, friendships, families, organizations, governments, countries, it trashes it all and keeps on going. And all of that is an outward expression of the inner destruction happening within our mind, happening within a mind that's just being eaten away by hate. In King's sermon, he spoke about hate causing us to become entirely different people. He said, you quote, you can't see straight when you hate. You can't walk straight when you hate. You can't stand upright. Your vision is distorted. There is nothing more tragic than to see an individual whose heart is filled with hate. For the person who hates, the beautiful becomes the ugly, and the ugly becomes the beautiful. For the person who hates, the good becomes the bad, and the bad becomes the good. For the person who hates, the true becomes the false, and the false becomes the true. That's what hate does. Now, the Course talks a lot about this distinction between true and false, between real and illusion. And it even uses similar language when it says, such as guilt's attraction. Here, death enthroned as savior, crucifixion is now redemption, and salvation can only mean destruction of the world. So there's danger in getting truth and illusion backwards. The Course calls this insanity. It uses the word madness, and we know what insanity and madness are. This is language we use for the state of being mentally ill. And the conclusion that we are left to draw is that hate distorts the hater by creating mental illness. It makes you break with reality. It makes you insane. And as with all mental illness, there is a cost. There's a cost in the long trail of broken relationships, and there's also a cost in function. So I've known people who were called to have a special function with the Course, even here at the Circle, and have lost their calling because of righteous anger. In the manual for teachers section on the characteristics of the teachers of God, it says that harmfulness completely obliterates our function from our awareness. And again, I've seen that happen so many times. The manual goes on to say that harmfulness makes us confused, fearful, angry, and suspicious. And this is what King was talking about when he said, when you hate, you can't see straight. When you hate, you can't walk straight. Your vision is distorted. That's what he's talking about. I remember when I was a child, I had a family member who was so mad at me one time that he was actually breathing like a beast. He was standing over me doing the thing. And he even told me to leave the house because he didn't trust himself to not physically attack me in the moment. This was someone who was otherwise normal, but the anger just took over and turned him into a monster. That's what we saw on October 7th, when Hamas proudly displayed bodies of hostages and crowds of supporters were cheering. Again, for the person who hates, everything gets reversed and upside down. The beautiful becomes the ugly, and the ugly becomes the beautiful. And otherwise normal people become monsters. That is a very high price to pay for holding on to our hate. As King said, it's ruinous. And no doubt, that's also why King said, I have decided to stick with love, for hate is too great a burden to bear. Before we leave this idea, there's one last point that I want to make about hate distorting the mind of the hater. There's a very popular belief in contemporary spirituality that we attack because we're afraid, that we're the persecuted hero trying to make our way through a world that is grossly unfair to us. But from a Course perspective, we don't attack because we're afraid. We're afraid because we attack. So in other words, we attack, we feel guilty, and then we become afraid because then we think other people or even God himself is going to attack us in return. This is not a very celebrated or very well-known idea. We love to think we're not angry. We love to think we're just afraid. But King got it. He got what the Course was saying. In the sermon, the Loving Your Enemies sermon, he said, psychologists and psychiatrists are telling us today that the more we hate, get this, the more we develop guilt feelings and we begin to subconsciously repress or consciously suppress certain emotions, and they all stack up in our subconscious selves, making for tragic, neurotic responses. You see that? He got the order right. We attack, we feel guilty, and then we behave in ways that he said destroy the hater as well as the hated. And so what is the way out? As always, there's an infinite number of ways to go backwards and only one way to go forward, and that's love. Love is the only way forward because love is redemptive. And this is the third point. Redemptive means reparative, restorative. Love fixes what's been broken by hate. And so it's not just that we love in order to be good people. That's part of it. But we also love in order to heal. Because in the end, love is the only thing that truly can. King said that love has a power that eventually transforms individuals. And it's interesting that he uses the word eventually, because sometimes it doesn't happen overnight. Most of the time, it doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen eventually. He said, quote, if you hate your enemies, you have no way to redeem or transform them. But if you love your enemies, you will discover that at the very root of love is the power of redemption. You just keep loving people and keep loving them, even though they're mistreating you. Now, imagine the conviction and the courage it would take to stand up in front of a crowd of people where you can bet that some of them have been clubbed with batons, attacked with dogs, sprayed with hoses, seen elderly women and children maced, and even had loved ones killed. People who were suffering through 400 years of oppression, and you're telling them to love the people who are doing that to you. We forget now, but King faced a lot of criticism and backlash for this view in his day. He was called a traitor to his people. He was called an Uncle Tom. He was called an ignorant preacher. And the civil rights movement was labeled peaceful suffering. And so as the nonviolent movement grew, there was a parallel movement that grew that said it isn't violence to teach people to defend themselves when they're the victims of violence, and anything else is dangerous pacifism. So if you were there, it would be a hard choice to know what to do, wouldn't it? Before protests and before sit-ins, especially at lunch counters, members of the civil rights movement would subject each other to various indignities just to get used to what was bound to happen to them. So before students participated in the lunch counter sit-ins, they would blow smoke in each other's faces. They would pour milkshakes on each other's heads. They would crack eggs on each other's head, and they would even get hit. All in preparation for what they were bound to experience. Could you do that? Could you get punched in the face, hit with a baton, or watch as your child got hit, or worse, and not respond accordingly? Or not think you had the right to respond accordingly? But when King was challenged on this point, he said, quote, "The means we use must be as pure as the ends we seek. It's wrong to use immoral means to gain moral ends." What he knew, because he learned it from Jesus and Gandhi, is that teaching people to love is more powerful than teaching them to fight. Hate has one speed: tear down and destroy. Love builds and repairs, and that's why it always wins in the end. Love is the law of God. The Course says there is no love but God's, and so it cannot fail to transform people eventually. There's a passage in A Course in Miracles that says, turning the other cheek does not mean that you should submit to violence without protest. It means that you cannot be hurt and do not want to show your brother anything except your wholeness. Show him that he cannot hurt you and hold nothing against him, or you will hold it against yourself. So in King's sermon, he talked about just wearing people down with love as the strategy. That's it. That's the strategy. He said, just keep being friendly to that person, keep loving them, don't do anything to embarrass them, just keep loving them, and they can't stand it too long. He said, oh, they may react in ways in the beginning. They may react with bitterness because they're mad because you love them like that. They may react with guilt feelings, and sometimes they'll hate you a little more at that transition period, but just keep loving them. And by the power of your love, they will break down under the load. That's love, you see, end quote. And so to demonstrate his point, King shared the story that I think a lot of people know now from Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, Team of Rivals. And as the story goes, Abraham Lincoln was running for president, and a powerful lawyer named Edwin Stanton was running around the country calling him an imbecile, a disgrace, and other nasty things. And so after King was elected president, he's in the beginning of the Civil War, and who does he choose to put on his cabinet as Secretary of War? Edwin Stanton, the guy who campaigned ferociously against him getting elected in the first place. And after King was assassinated, King said that, quote, one of the greatest words or statement ever made about Abraham Lincoln was made by Stanton. And as Abraham Lincoln's life drained out of his body, Stanton stood up and said, "Now he belongs to the ages." And he made a beautiful statement concerning the character and the stature of this man. If Abraham Lincoln had hated Stanton, if Abraham Lincoln had answered everything Stanton said with hate, Stanton would have gone to his grave hating Lincoln, but Lincoln would have gone to his grave hating Stanton. It was through the power of love that Abraham Lincoln was able to redeem Stanton, end quote. King said, "There's a power in love that our world has not discovered yet." Jesus discovered it a few centuries ago. I'd say Jesus brought it. Mahatma Gandhi of India discovered it a few years ago. But King says most men and women never discover it, for they believe in hitting for hitting. They believe in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. They believe in hating for hating. But Jesus came to us and said, this isn't the way. So I hope by now you can see more clearly the connection between the teachings of Martin Luther King and the teachings of A Course in Miracles. If you boil the Course down to its simplest essence, it's a path about training our minds to see past the body, past the ego of other people to their invisible divine reality, because seeing that is what heals them and it's what heals you. Everything in the Course rests on that one idea. It's how we pray. It's how we offer physical healing. It's how we offer therapy. It's how we forgive. It's how we work miracles. It's how we love. And in the end, that was King's message too. Love those who hate you because they are a reflection of God. And because love is what heals them, love is redemptive. And when you heal them, you heal yourself and you heal society as a whole. There's so much more that could be said, but that's the essence of it for me. I see a straight line between the authentic teachings of Jesus, Martin Luther King, and A Course in Miracles. Again, King's teaching, in my view, is the thing that is most like the Course that I've seen. It is so easy to hate and to hit back. Just look around. We are so good at that. No one seems to know how to dim the lights. What's hard, as King said, is to overcome violence and oppression without resorting to violence and oppression. That's what's hard. And that's why love is the only way through. But because it's hard, because it's countercultural, that's part of why the world hasn't discovered the power of love yet. Because to the world, love looks like madness, dangerous pacifism. The writer H.G. Wells said about Jesus, either there was something mad about this man, or our hearts are still too small for his message. When Robert and I went to Atlanta, we went to King's burial site, and there's a wall that talks about beloved community. And so I want to end on that because beloved community is what the Course wants for us all. King famously envisioned a, quote, beloved community where men will live together as brothers, where conflicts are resolved peacefully and without bitterness, where all of creation is embraced with a spirit of hope and goodwill, and where everyone works together to defeat injustice, not each other. So, in other words, a better way. Course students will recognize the language of a better way, because for us, this is what the Course envisions as well. A better way to get along, where we can cooperate instead of compete. So I love that these two roads King and the course are all leading to the same place. A better way is beloved community, and beloved community is a better way. And so, as we honor the legacy of Martin Luther King today, it seems that the very best way we can do that is to embody the ideals of beloved community that he stood for, which are the shared ideals of the course. Radical equality, inherent divinity in all, what King called dangerous unselfishness, redemption through love, and the courage to stand for forgiveness in a world that does not yet understand its power. These qualities may not sound controversial, but I assure you they are. So I'm going to close by reading a passage from King's last speech in Memphis. He gave this speech the night before he was killed. It's an incredible piece of history, not only for what King says about the accomplishments of the civil rights movement, but what he said about how he's at peace with his own journey, how he knew the movement was going to end in victory, and how he might not be there with everyone to see it. It's remarkable and really prophetic. And in the speech, he tells the story about what happened in Birmingham, where he was arrested and where he wrote Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And just listen to this. It's incredible. He said, "We just went on before the dogs and we would look at them. We'd go on before the water hoses and we would look at it. And we'd just go on singing, 'Over my head, I see freedom in the air.' And then we would be thrown in the paddy wagons, and sometimes we were stacked in there like sardines in a can. They would throw us in, and Old Bull would say, 'Take them off,' and they did. We would just go in the paddy wagon singing, 'We shall overcome.' And every now and then we'd get in jail, and we'd see the jailers looking through the windows, being moved by our prayers, and being moved by our words and our songs. And there was a power there which Bull Connor couldn't adjust to. So we ended up transforming Bull into a steer, and we won our struggle in Birmingham." What has violence ever done that could come anywhere close to that? What a powerful and world-changing example of reflecting on the life and the teachings of Jesus. Thank you.